On February 27, 1989, the Venezuelan people spoke up against hunger and misery, the result of policies implemented by the president at the time, Carlos Andrés Pérez, a situation that worsened after the implementation of the neoliberal policy package set up by the IMF. Law enforcement authorities, together with the army, cracked down on the popular uprising that had taken to the streets to protest against economic package that was set up to allegedly solve the economic crisis resulting from decades of outward corruption. According to extra-official sources, the situation resulted in the death of approximately 3,000 Venezuelans, a breaking point in history that paved the way for a historic deed, the Bolivarian and Socialist Revolution, headed by Commander Hugo Chavez.
From Caracas, I'm Cody Weddle. Today I'm joined by Jose Luis Martinez. He is a participant and a survivor, really, of the 1989 Caracazo, what came to be known as the Caracazo here in Venezuela, an uprising of people against the government of that time. The resulting crackdown by the government led to hundreds, if not thousands, of deaths. And Mr. Martinez, thanks so much for joining us. To begin, explain to me, if you will, when somebody says Caracazo, what are they referring to?
Well, the Caracazo shouldn't be called Caracazo, I think. It should be called Venezolanazo, because in many parts of the country there was a popular uprising in which the people, without any leader, took to the streets to protest against the economic and social measures of the Carlos Andrés Pérez government against the people. The people had no other option than to take to the street to buy without paying their product, something that they couldn't get before because of neoliberal policies. As mass media told us that we couldn't buy color television, only few people, few houses could afford color TV, and that generated the difference of classes. That's why the people took to the street because they couldn't afford food, TV, uh, or healthcare, because there was a policy of privatizations.
So tell me a little bit about the situation here in Venezuela when those people rose up as part of this Caracazo. What was it like exactly? You were talking about it a little bit.
Well, we couldn't find food anywhere. There was no employment. There was a high unemployment rate, I remember. And that started because of the Black Friday. Factories were closed. And during that time, I spent 5 years without a stable job. And then I could get a stable job in 1987. And a lot of people had no stable job. When the Caracas took place, the people didn't have money, couldn't afford to pay food. There was no milk, there was no flour, cooking oil. There was, and it was because of businessmen speculated. They were hoarding because waiting for the economic measures of the Carlos Andrés Pérez government, so they could increase prices and profits.
And tell me a little bit about your situation. Why did you decide to participate in something like this?
It was not that I wanted to take place. On the 27th, I went to my job. I was in charge of managing a warehouse in the Petales Guarenas highway. So when the Caracas took place, I couldn't go to my job because of a lack of transportation. So the next day, I decided to go to my place, and there was no transportation again. So I went back to my place. So when I came to a neighbor's house on their flat roof, I started to see what was happening in the Romulo Gallegos Avenue. So I saw two Metropolitan Police officers and a girl and a woman, and the officers shot the women. So I was so enraged that I started swearing at them. And there was one of them who was wearing gray, took a gun and shot at me. I was shot in the abdomen. So I saw that he was jumping out of joy because he had shot me. And I told my brother I was shot. He told me to go back so he could take me, but I fainted and I lost consciousness. When I went to the hospital, when I was taken to the hospital, uh, they told my brother I had died, and I was taken to the morgue. But as I was entering the morgue, I told them not to let me die. So I had 3 surgeries. I spent 17 days in the coma, and I had a permanent injury in my leg. I couldn't walk for a year by myself. At the end of 1989, I joined the Committee of Families and Victims because at the end of 1989, this group changed it to the Miraflores building, demanding for them to reopen the common graves, and they attained that goal. The common graves were opened, and 9 bodies were found, and 3 of them were identified, and that was huge because I saw the there were bodies without head, without legs, and some of them without fingers, and then I was told by some Argentinian anthropologists that they had taken their fingers so as not so as the corpse not to be recognized, and it was huge. I imagine that it could have been some of them, and today I feel that what Padre Matias did and some other Christians did and some other priests did, they tried to help us. They helped us to organize as a committee, and it was a hard work, but we did it. There was a time in which we were disappointed because when the attempt of the coup d'etat took place, before that, there was a judge that took that were supposed to take measures.
And I want to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But the authorities during this Caracazo were just shooting.
Well, they just started shooting everybody. That's what they were told to do. And I remember the Ministry of Defense went through the manual of procedures of the armed forces, and it says that when the armed forces couldn't control the situation, they had to start shooting everybody. Basically, it is what it says, and they did, as well as the intelligence, police, the SIP, and some other law enforcement units. For example, in Petare, near to Palo Verde, more than 30 people were murdered there, and there was Prince Matia with a Cossack who tried to help people, a person who was shot dead there, but the military men started shooting towards the place he was, but he managed to talk to a senior officials as well, and the priest was given 15 minutes to take the corpse out of there. But it was huge to see the military forces, the army shooting the people, and there was also a man who was shot inside her house. Her mother was near him, and he was looking at what was happening, and he was shot in his head. It was a 14-year-old guy. What could a boy his age do? Nothing.
Friends, family members.
The place where I live, there's a person missing that we haven't found it yet. There was another girl who lived near my place who was shot as she was breastfeeding. She was shot in the head, and there was another person who disappeared.
And so after this massive massacre, what was the attitude in the city? What was the feeling? How did things change?
Well, after the judge decided not to continue with the investigation, we were discouraged. We got discouraged. A sector of society felt that we there was no point in going to the polls. There was no leadership in Venezuela until February the 4th when Hugo Chavez came and he gave us hope. So we felt that was justice. And it was not until 1998 when Commander Chavez was elected that he called for a national constituent assembly and he left us a legacy, this constitution we have nowadays, which is the best, I think, regarding human rights, because we have a previous constitution that talked about human rights, but this one has more details and is more comprehensive. Now we feel that there is hope, and when the Inter-American Court of Human Rights decided that the rule that human rights were breached in Venezuela and that 44 victims were to be given reparations, President Chavez said that he recognized that, but he was not going to give reparations just to 44 victims, but all of the victims. And still, we have this process open. Victims are still given reparations, and it was thanks to President Chavez. And it was in 2006 when he demanded to reopen all of the cases of crimes against humanity. A task force was created in the National Assembly. It was headed by Ricardo Gutierrez and some other attorneys, which was Dr. Padrino, Melvin Morales. All of them carried out an investigation until we could pass a law against silence and oblivion, as we call it, and we created a commission of truth.
And you keep speaking about Chavez. After the 1989 the Caracazo in 1992, he sort of rose to fame. He attempted to take power here in Venezuela. That was unsuccessful. But later in 1998, he overwhelmingly was elected here in Venezuela. As somebody who participated in or was affected by the Caracazo in 1989, how did you view and how do you view today President Chavez?
I see him as a supporter of human rights. And it's so that when he took office, he created or he gave us power, gave the society power and in the decision making. So I earned my degrees on social management thanks to him and because he created the university.
And did you ever in your life imagine that this would happen to you?
No, I didn't imagine this could have happened or this could happen to me. There was repression by law enforcement authorities, but I never imagined that.
And also as someone who was affected by those historic events, how do you view the situation in Venezuela today?
I think these are different situations. For on the one hand, there was a high unemployment rate in the past, but nowadays maybe we have a crisis. We don't find some products, but there is a high employment rate. People can afford buying food. But in the past, they couldn't afford those to buy some products. So we also have social inclusion. In the past, we did not have access to university. Now we do. We have social inclusion in the health system, for example. That's a big difference. Maybe there is disagreement with the government, but I feel that the situations are different. Well, maybe we have some with the situation, the lack of products, but as I told you, there people can afford the products.
And what physical ailments have you suffered through the years as a result of your injury?
Well, I lost a kidney because of the situation. I couldn't. I was ill during 10 years. Nowadays, thanks to the social inclusion by Comandante Chavez, I have a stable job, a profession, and I feel that we have to continue doing what President Chavez did, and we have to continue strengthening this process. And I hope that we overcome this economic war because Venezuela have to continue with development, not only in this country but the region.
And what about the street protests of February of last year? Uh, what what went through your mind when that was happening here in Venezuela?
Well, in the 80s, we protested because of water, of basic services, but we were right about it. These guarimbas, these riots, were criminal acts. People who went or took to the street to kill the same people and to overthrow a government is different from what we did in the past, social demands. Because if you ask them, why are you protesting? They say we have to get rid of Maduro, but why? They don't tell you why. Just to they have to get rid of Maduro. But in the past we said that there was a social demand because of basic services, student first, water, electricity, a decent housing.
And thinking back to the late 80s when you had the government of Perez here in Venezuela, if the situation of the Guarembas had the tactics of the Guaremberos had been used, then what do you think the reaction of the government would have been?
Well, in the past, there were some people who were murdered because of painting on the streets, on the walls, just like that. Imagine that if we had done and what they did with during the Garimbas, if we had done that, a lot of people would have died. But we never did that. We did never attack the National Guard or kill National Guards or some other officers. We didn't do that in the past. Maybe it happened with the guerrilla wars, but it was another context. But during our protest in the 80s, every protest resulted in death of a student by the Metropolitan Police. And we didn't destroy buildings, we didn't kill people, we just protesting because of first.
Or in other words, you didn't use the tactics that we saw in February of last year.
No, we didn't do that in the past. And even though we had some partners who were in the subversive wars, they didn't think about it. They didn't think to do about doing what they did in the past.
Why not?
Because at that time they had an ideological thinking. They thought of socialism, but they wanted to use violence. And Commander Chavez didn't do that. He thought about the polls, and he was right, and history was right. And he convinced those people and brought us to the social struggle.
And today, all these years later, is there any connection with the victims from that event now 26 years ago? Were there movements to bring justice? Did you all connect in any way?
Well, our ombudsman, Tarek Williams, decided to convene a meeting with Organization of Human Rights in Venezuela, and he helped us to organize with the Committee of Families of Victims of the Guarimbas, the riots in 2014, also some other organizations, Committee of Victims of Puente Guayaguno, Victims of Cantagua. We had an organization, and I feel that Commission of Truth and Justice that was approved in 2012 is organizing this committee, these people, victims of the riots. Yes, there's an organization because we struggle. We have the same struggle. We have the same struggle. No impunity.
And what have you done as a group of victims? Have you done anything to remember those who died during that event?
When the Commission of Truth and Justice was established, in Article 26, it talks about the recovery of historical memory. It means to talk to victims or to families, to see where those people were buried, and to investigate everything, audiovisual material, print material, press, and to elaborate a report that will be released in 2 years. And we think this report will highlight this fact, so the Venezuelan people won't forget what happened, because we forget easily what happened in the past. So we have to continue highlighting the situation so these crimes don't happen again. So the future of generations see what happened in the past, how our human rights were breached continuously during more than 40 years. Nowadays, we're working with a committee of families of victims, and I work for the Commission of Justice and Truth, and carry on an investigation in the National Assembly to elaborate this report that will be released. And I think that the report will show all the events that happened during 4 years, and this report,
And do you think the average Venezuelan is aware, to what extent do you think the average Venezuelan is aware of the Caracazo?
if you go to a high school, these boys know little about what happened in the past. And I think the state have to show more what happened in the past, how our rights were breached, 40 years of pseudo-democracy. So we don't forget the history, so there is justice, which is what we want, so this won't happen again.
And why is it important not to forget?
Because if we forget what happened, if there's another government of this kind that we had during 40 years, if they start to violate human rights, well, there won't be justice. People will think there's justice, but they are actually violating human rights. And I feel that we have to remember what happened so it won't happen again.
Jose Luis Martinez, thank you so much for sharing your incredible story from 1989, the Caracazo here in Venezuela. Thanks so much for tuning in with us From Caracas. I'm Cody Weddle. We'll see you again next week.